the warrior cult, that these men became almost invincible. You know the movie that they just came out, The 300? The 300? The 300 were Spartan homosexuals, right? They don't tell you that in the movie. No one would want to go out and see it, but that's what it was. And they were incredibly effective military force. In fact, the most aggressive militaries in the history of the world have had this warrior cult component. The Zulu tribes in Africa, for example, the Zulus have been defending the South African Constitution's acceptance of gay marriage on the grounds that Zulus traditionally allowed adult, teenage, homosexual sex in that context. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about pederasty. That traditionally, in the modern context, we're talking in America, you talk about homosexuality, and you look at the gay movement, and they're presenting an image of adult people of comparable ages wanting to cohabit together, and they're just sort of they're sort of the corollary of the natural family. They just happen to sleep with someone of the same gender instead of the opposite. And that's a phony facade. It's true to some extent. Some of them are that way. But historically, homosexuality has always been identified with pederasty, adult men and teenage boys, all through history. And that's what these guys were focused on. Der Eigene was reviving that. And these men, they hated the effeminate homosexuals. They said that their homosexual masculinity was superior to normal masculinity, and that they were better than average men because of this orientation that they had, that every nation state in the history of the world had been formed by men like them, and that they looked on these effeminate homosexuals with disdain. They called them Kummerlings, puny beings. The idea was that a man who would give up his masculinity in favor of effeminacy was subhuman. And that was the attitude that they had. If you can understand what was going on. Now, these effeminate homosexuals were associated with the Communist Party in Germany, right? The Scientific Humanitarian Committee was allied with the communists, and the masculine homosexuals, the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, was allied with the fascists. Now, it wasn't any Nazi party at this time, but there was a whole movement of people that would later become Nazis that were all rooted in the masculine side of the German gay subculture. Now, you got Adolf Brand, you've got Benedict Friedlander, you've got Wilhelm Janssen, who are running this organization, Gemeinschaft der Eigenen. They then get control of the German Boy Scout movement called the Wandervogel, called the Wandering Youth. And Wilhelm Janssen especially gets control of this of the youth movement, and they begin training the boys this is like the equivalent of the Boy Scouts. This is like if in the United States, if the homosexual men got control of the Boy Scouts, this is the sort of thing that we're all worried about would happen. It did happen in Germany. They actually took control of the Wandervogel. Wilhelm Janssen, and then a man named Hans Blur, and Hans Blur, who actually was an ideologue for the Nazis later. Well, what they did is they took these boys, they trained them in these ideas. The Männerbund, that's what they called it, the all-male society. And they trained them with this sort of military mindset. These were the young men that later would become the stormtroopers on the battlefield. And they were the earliest of the Nazis. You know where the term stormtrooper comes from? It comes from the German. It's an occult identity. Wotan, the god of the sky, was a symbol for the stormtroopers, and and these were men who, on the battlefields of World War I, were so ferocious and so fierce that they would actually jump up from the trenches on one side and run across the battlefield and dive into the other trenches and kill the enemy. That's how they became known. What caused them to have that kind of warrior ethic? It was the training that they had in the Wandervogel. I've got some quotes that I wanted to read to you about some of the. Well, I'll show you something else too. This is about the use of the swastika. You know, a lot of the things that we identify with Nazism are actual, almost everything that's a symbol of Nazism comes out of some aspect of the homosexual subculture of Germany. This right here is you see the swastika in this is the rune alphabet. It's Guido von List was one of the occultists who was responsible for developing sort of pre-Nazi sentiments. Now, remember, I was going to tell you there's 3 trails that lead into Nazism. One of them is the German gay movement. It starts with the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen. It goes through the Wandervogel and then to the SA. I didn't finish telling you that. Let me finish telling you about that. In Germany, in World War I, the Germans lost, and the Allies imposed a condition on them that they could not have any more than 100,000 men in arms, and they had lots of soldiers. That put them all out of work. What the Nationalists did in order to get around the rule is that they organized all these men into unofficial military units. They took the junior officers of the German, former junior officers of the German army, and they would put them as the head of these squads that were called Freikorps. And these Freikorps were military units. They just didn't have guns. Now, the guns were hidden. The Nationalists had storehouses of guns. They were waiting, biding their time when they would be able to come back into power. But these Freikorps were there. They were all over the place, and several of them were very significant in the development of Nazism. There was one in particular. It was headed by a man named Gerhard Rossbach. And I've got a great quote in here about Gerhard Rossbach. His Freikorps was called the Rossbach Bund, and it was made up of all homosexuals. It was a homosexual Freikorps. This is from a book by Robert Waite called The Psychopathic God Adolf Hitler. With the exception of Gerhard Rossbach, sadist, murderer, and homosexual, was the most admired hero of nationalistic German youth. In Erhard, but also in Rossbach, says a popular book on the youth movement, we see the Führer of our youth. These men have become the ideal man, idolized and honored as can only happen when the personality of an individual counts for more than anything else. The most important single contributor of the pre-Hitler youth movement was Gerhard Rossbach. Rossbach was a sort of bridge from the youth movement, the Wandervogel youth movement, to the SA, because it was Rossbach's Rossbach Bund that became the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers. And they were also known as the brown shirts. And they were known as brown shirts because they did something different than all the other Freikorps. All the other Freikorps wore the leftover gray uniforms that they had worn in the German army in World War I. But Rossbach, he went and got brown uniforms from the army surplus stores that were left over from the colonies that Germany had lost in Africa. Remember, at World War I, Germany lost its colonies. And so the surplus store had all these uniforms. So Rossbach, he thought he'd make his group different, so they wore brown uniforms. That's how they became known as the brown shirts. And so all of the brown shirts, especially at the beginning, were homosexuals. And they were Rossbach's guys. Gerhard Rossbach, he introduced another man into homosexuality named Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm was really, at the beginning, he was the power behind the throne of the German, of the Nazi party. He was actually more powerful than Hitler at the very beginning. It went from Rossbach, he was the head of the SA, then it was Goering, and then it wasn't Goering. It was the former World War I ace. I can't remember his name right now. Then it was Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SA. And so you have this trail all the way up leading right into the Nazis. It was the SA, it was the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, who really were able to bring the Nazis into power, especially in the early days, through their violence, through their brown shirt tactics, right? Everything we talk about today, when you talk about fascism, you're talking about the brown shirts, the homosexual Freikorps that Gerhard Rossbach started. Okay, so that brings you up to the early 20s, Now let's go